Hey class. In this lesson, we're going to look at Immanuel Kant and specifically his epistemological, metaphysical, uh, philosophical ideas, preparing the way for the moral philosophy, which we'll deal with in the next lesson. And Kant's philosophy, on the one hand, is presented in a way which is extremely difficult to understand. He's one of the most difficult philosophers for the sheer fact that his presentation of the ideas is extremely technical. It uses a ton of jargon, and he's establishing all of these new terminology. It's extremely counterintuitive when you first encounter it. But that being said, I think on the other hand, the ideas are actually somewhat straightforward, and given the right presentation can become much easier to understand, translated into a different set of terms. So I'm going to attempt to do that for you. I'm going to try and give it to you in a way. I'm still going to use his terminology. I'm still going to refer to it, but I'm going to try to present it in a way that makes it more comprehensible for you. So he has three main works: the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, and the Critique of Judgment, or Aesthetic Judgment would be a better term for it. So these three books, there is main three works. There's critical works. And critique, we think of critique as like criticizing someone. Well, that's sort of what he's doing, but he's criticizing the faculties of the mind itself. What are the faculties of the mind, and what can they do responsibly, or what can they do which is within their proper power? How can we use these faculties properly? That's really the central question of this critique. So the critical philosophy is an attempt to evaluate the nature of the mind, what powers it has, what abilities it has, and to find their proper scope, to find their proper application. So in the Critique of Pure Reason, he's looking at what is reason, what is the understanding, what is intellect, and what is the proper use of the faculty, what is the proper use of this power? How can we put it to use in a way that is legitimate, in a way that is in accordance with its power? So the first major idea of the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason is also called the first critique because it's the first of those three. The first main idea is this Copernican revolution of thought. So Copernicus, he said that, we have these heliocentric models. That means that the heliocentric is the one that says that the sun is at the center. And then there's, that was his model. But the models that came before that said that the Earth was at the center of the universe and everything moved around it. So you look up in the sky and you see the stars moving and the Earth seems to be at rest. So all of these astronomical accounts prior to Copernicus said that the Earth is at the center and everything moves around. So the Copernican revolution flips that and says, no, actually, the sun is at the center and the Earth revolves around it. So there's going to be something metaphorically or analogously going on with Kant, this kind of reversal of what is at the center. So let me just say a little bit more about this Copernican revolution first, about Copernicus himself. So one of the main problems, so Ptolemy had this system that tried to explain this problem. And that is that all of the stars move together, but the planets do this weird retrograde movement where all of a sudden they turn backwards and then go forwards again. So this happens not in one night, so you can't watch the star do this. But if you plot it every day, every night, for a week or two, you'll see that it moves in this line, and every day it goes, it's in a new spot, and it moves in this retrograde movement that you see on the side here. So that was something that the previous models could not account for. And Copernicus, his model is able to explain this appearance. It's able to explain this thing that we see. So it explains the apparent movement of the planet by an unseen movement, the movement of the Earth. So while the scientists at the time, Copernicus, Kepler, they could not, Tycho Brahe is another one, they could not observe the movement of the Earth itself because they were on it and they didn't have spaceships or anything like that. All they could observe was the movements of the night sky. So by postulating this unseen movement, the movement of the Earth, these apparent movements, these movements that we can see, can be explained if we assume this unseen movement. So the unseen movement is a kind of hypothesis that Copernicus made, and later it proved to be true. But the point here is that by postulating this unseen movement and by changing what we put at the center, all of the phenomenon, all of the apparent movements can be explained. So that's what's metaphorically going to be the same. So for Kant, it's not about planets, it's not about movements that we observe in the sky. It's about the relationship between the mind and the world of objects that it perceives. So the mind conforms to objects in the world. That was the model of knowledge of Descartes, of medieval metaphysics, and even of Aristotle. So we observe certain things, and the mind needs to conform to those objects, and if it's capable of conforming to those objects, then truth comes about. So that was the model that Kant needs to reverse, that he needs to flip. So he needs to do a Copernican revolution on that model. So what happens then? Instead of the object being at the center of the universe, so to speak, the mind becomes the center of the universe. So objects conform to the mind. This is a very counterintuitive idea. You look at something and it seems like you're conforming to that thing. And that's what allows you to think it. It's a tree because it has the appearance that I see, and my mind acquiesces on that appearance rather than the reverse. So the mind is actually what is at the center. The mind is what objects need to conform to. That's what Kant's idea is. So by doing this revolution, Kant says that we can explain the apparent object, the things in nature, by an unseen activity, just like the unseen activity of the Earth. But in this case, that unseen activity is not the movement of the Earth, it's the synthesis of the mind. So the mind does an activity of synthesizing. It's doing a certain work, and that work, although we don't see it directly, is what is responsible for bringing about the objects of experience. So sensation in the old model was supposed to present a cognizable object, an object which we can think. Cognizable is similar to recognizable, but in this sense it just means something that we can think. So we think the object as something coherent. So the old model says that sensation does that. Kant's model, the new model, the Copernican revolution of thought, says that it's a synthetic activity of the mind which makes that possible. So basically the idea here is that all of our knowledge of experience, all of our knowledge, empirical knowledge, all of our knowledge of appearances in reality, sensible world, and all of this, that is possible only because of the mind, because the mind has a certain structure, it has an intelligible set of concepts and ideas which it uses in order to understand things. So I see a tree and I understand that it is a unity and that it has a certain identity, that all of the leaves and the branches and all of that conform together, cohere in one object or one unity. So Kant wants to say that the idea of coherence, unity, identity, all of those things that I see in the tree, those are really just properties of our mind. We don't ever find those things in reality. We have those in our mind, and we force the world to conform to those things. Unity, identity, these kinds of things, cause and effect, as we're going to see. They're all endemic to the mind. They're all native to the mind, not to the world that we perceive. So that's the Copernican revolution. And closely related to this idea is the thing in itself versus the appearance. So all of the previous theories thought that we had a relation with the thing in itself. The sensation presents itself as a cognizable object. The objects in the world are presented, and the mind has to conform to them. Therefore, we have access to these things in themselves. But what Kant wants to say is, no, these are really just appearances. And these appearances of the thing are determined by the activity of the mind, not by the thing in itself. Okay, so that's the kind of overall view that Kant is working towards in the first critique, this Copernican revolution, that the mind is an activity of synthesis, and that is what is responsible for experience. He then goes on to cut this up into three main activities, or three main syntheses. You have the transcendental aesthetic, the transcendental deduction, and the transcendental unity of apperception. So I'm going to go through those three quickly here and explain what they are. So when we sense things, we sense them in two forms, in the form of space and in the form of time. And it's impossible for us to have a coherent experience of sensation that don't have the form of space and time. You look around and you see things spatially related, you see something move, and you see it move as one continuous movement because of a unity of time. It started at T1, and then at T2 it was over there, and that was one continuous time between them. So the mind is what is in charge of these forms. This is what Kant is trying to say. So aesthetic, that comes from the Greek word aisthenomai, to sense, to perceive. And so the transcendental aesthetic, the word transcendental, we're going to come closer and closer to what this exactly means, but it's essentially what it means is the conditions for the possibility of experience. So if we have a certain experience, what is it that makes that experience possible? That's the question Kant wants to answer. And he wants to say that insofar as we have a sensuous experience, an experience of sensations, it will have coherence, it will be intelligible, we'll be able to actually experience something coherently if it has the forms of space and time. And Kant asserts emphatically that these forms of space and time are properties of our mind and not properties of objects. So that's the transcendental aesthetic. It's the forms of sensation. And we're going to talk about this in a few slides, but form and matter, as we have encountered with Aristotle, if you were in the previous course, that's called a hulomorphism. And Kant adopts this idea of hulomorphism, applying it to experience, and says that sensation has a form and a matter. So the form of experience is space and time. The matter, as we'll see in a little bit, is a multiplicity, a manifold, as he calls it, of reality, which comes through the senses, but which on its own has no coherence. Its coherence comes about through the form of sensation of space and time. More on that in a minute. So once we have a spatio-temporal sensation, we apply concepts to that. And that's what the transcendental deduction gets at. What are the possible concepts of our understanding? So if I see a tree, I see it as having a certain spatial determination to it. And then I apply to that spatial determination the idea of unity, or of reality, or of having certain properties, brownness, roughness, and those properties cohere in an object, a substance. And so all of those things, those are thoughts, those are concepts. We apply those concepts to the experience, to the sensation. Because there's a certain spatio-temporal coordination, we can apply a concept to that. And that's what the transcendental deduction gets at. How is it that we apply concepts, ideas, to experience? And then lastly, we have the transcendental unity of apperception. This is the most fundamental synthesis that the mind is capable of. We're going to get to this in a few slides, so I don't want to say too much now, but it's the way that the mind is capable of unifying all of its own experiences such that they form a cohesive unity over time. I have moments in my past that I identify equally with moments in my present, and those form a cohesive unity, which I call myself. And there's a synthetic act, Kant wants to say, that is responsible for making my coherent experience a whole. And that will be called the transcendental unity of apperception. So all three of these syntheses work together to make experience coherent. So Kant's philosophy asks the question, how is cognition possible? How is experience possible? How is it possible that I experience things in a coherent manner? This question, the question of the possibility of cognition, seeks the components of experience. And that's what transcendental philosophy says. So we have these all of these experiences with all of the data of experience, colors, feelings, warmth, cold, spatio-temporal relations, all of this. That would be the immanent data. So immanent versus transcendent. The transcendent would be what doesn't appear as such, but what is responsible for experience. And that would be an act of synthesis. So you have all these data of experience, but that data would be a confused just mass of colors and sounds and things like that if it wasn't a coherent experience in which sounds articulate voice, for instance, or colors cohere in a single object, like a tree, right? So how is it that these components of experience are organized? That's what transcendental philosophy gets at. What is the transcendental? That is what is not immediately given, but what is organizing what is given. So we have a direct access to sensibility. Sensibility is given in degrees of reality. I feel a certain heat. That's a degree of reality. No feeling can ever be a 0 degree of reality, Kant says. That means that every sensation has a certain reality to it. We can't have an empty reality given in sensation. On the other hand, intuition of space and time, that can be completely drained of all reality. Imagine in your mind right now an empty space in which you can draw a triangle or a circle, or you can look at an object and then remove everything that is real about that object and just experience the spatial extension of it. There would be no reality there. Reality is something that it forces itself upon our senses. We see red, or we feel heat, or we feel a certain force of gravity in an object in our hand or something like that. That's reality. There's a degree of reality there that sensibility gives us. Intuition, on the other hand, the form of sensibility, space and time, they can be completely drained of all reality, and they still have some determinacy to them. This pure thought of space and time. So experience requires us to have these two components: a sensibility, this degree of reality given in our body's relationship to things in the world. That's the one half, that's the material half. And then the formal half, the intuition, the spatio-temporal relationships among things. So he says, in whatever way and through whatever means a cognition may relate to objects, and through which it relates immediately to them, and at which all thought as a means is directed to an end, is intuition. This, however, takes place only insofar as the object is given to us, but this, in turn, at least for us humans, is possible only if it affects the mind in a certain way. The capacity, receptivity, to acquire representations through the way in which we are affected by objects is called sensibility. So sensibility requires that we have receptivity to the objects. The objects have to be given to us. He says, objects, therefore, given to us by means of sensibility, and it alone affords us intuitions. So the idea is that our sense of space and time arises by means of our sensations. We sense objects, and therefore our mind is spontaneously driven to form it in space and time. He says next that, but they are thought, through the understanding, and from it arises concepts. So we see a tree, there's a certain degree of reality which is received by the colors and the mostly by the colors in that sense, because you're looking at the tree. You can also feel it, the roughness of it and things like that. That spurs the mind to grasp its coherence in a certain space. And then thought arises in terms of concepts. And what does the concept do? It does not grasp it straight away in a direct manner in the way that sensibility and intuition do, but through a detour, he says, in an indirect way, by means of certain marks. What does this mean? Well, if we see it in terms of concepts are things that apply to many things. So I say that the tree is a form of unity, and that all of its parts form a totality. Well, I could easily apply that equally to a book. I could say that the book is a unity and that it has a totality of all of its parts. So a tree and a book are completely different things. And so when I think unity in both of these cases, the thing that I think, the unity that I think as a concept, is not what is particular to either of these things. It's something that is general, something that applies equally to many things, and therefore is something indirect. It's not something that is singular to the object that I'm thinking, but something general to many objects. And it's something that is a feature of our mind rather than the feature of objects. So through concepts, we think things in an indirect manner. We don't go directly for the thing. We use something general, a kind of structure, it's almost like a scaffolding put on the side of a building. You can move that scaffolding around and put it on different buildings, and it can be applied to them. It's this superstructure imposed on it from the outside. That's what concepts are like. They're like these superstructures which we impose on many different objects, and which allow us to get at it from an external, indirect method. So experience is drawing together all of these different things. There's the sensibility given in reality. There's the intuition that arises in relation to that. And then there's these indirect concepts being applied to that. So experience is the compound of these different things. It has a matter and a form. The matter is coming through sensation. The form is coming from the mind. And so the Copernican revolution again would be that in the old model, the object was the form and our mind was the matter. and that the form was being impressed on our mind, and that it was being put into our mind, kind of like insignia pushed into wax. You make a seal, and it puts you could put a coin or something like that into the wax. So we were supposed to be the wax in which the form of the sensation was being imparted to us. Kant flips this and says, no, the sensuous data comes in, and the mind stamps it with its own superstructure, with its own concepts, and with its own forms. So the Transcendental aesthetic talks about the form of experience, the form of sensation. Sensation is stamped with the form of time. So he says time is not an empirical concept that is somehow drawn from experience, for its simultaneity or succession would not themselves come into perception if the representation of time did not ground them a priori. So we would never find anything coherent in sensation if the mind did not already have a priori, prior to experience, those forms which it imposes on sensation. So sensation would never become coherent in the first place if the mind didn't already possess these powers. He says, only under its presupposition can one represent the several things existing at one and the same time, simultaneously, or in different times successively. So the Transcendental aesthetic involves both time and space. We're looking at time right now. Time is a certain coherence of parts successively. This thing, then this thing, then this thing, then this thing. Space is one that is simultaneous. Over here and over here are at the same time, but different places, right? Successively would be different places in time. Simultaneously would be different places in space. So the mind has this ability to order, to organize, to make coherent in terms of simultaneity and in terms of successiveness. These things cannot be given in experience. They have to be forms of our own mind ordering experience in order for sensation to ever become comprehensible. So time is a necessary representation that grounds all intuitions. Grounds here means makes possible. He says, in regard to appearance in general, one cannot remove time, though one can very well take the appearances away from time. So this is what I was saying before. You can have an object that you experience. It has colors and shapes and things like that. Remove all of those, you still have the form of space. Well, the same thing goes for time. He says, time is therefore given a priori. It is in it alone all actuality of appearance is possible. The latter could all disappear, but time itself, the universal condition of possibility, cannot be removed. So you have a succession of experiences in which you feel different qualities. Warmth, right? You go from being cold to becoming warm. Now you can remove the content of that, the cold and the warm, and you still have an order before and after. So that is the a priori form, the prior to all experience. That order can be real without having any reality within it. So this a priori necessity also grounds the possibility of apodictic principles of relation of time, or axioms of time in general. Not going to get into that. It has only one dimension. Different times are not simultaneous but successive, just as different spaces are not successive but simultaneous. So there's the difference between time and space. These principles cannot be drawn from experience, for this would yield neither strict universality nor apodictic certainty. So he says that these principles are valid as rules under which alone experiences are possible at all. So space and time are rules. They are the rules of order and organization which the mind applies to experience in order for there to be anything in experience that is coherent cohesive, that makes sense. So we tend to think that we look out in the world and we see spatial relationships given to us through sensation. But Kant's whole point is that no, these are what experience introduces, that the mind introduces in order to make experience coherent and conceivable. So time and space are pure forms of sensibility. They are not given through the object, but they are endemic to the mind. They are what the mind produces in order to make experience comprehensible. So when we experience things, the mind is synthesizing the manifold. It's bringing things together in a coherent way. And Kant is trying to point out to us that this activity of the mind is essential to understanding how experience comes about. And so we have intuition, which is unifying a manifold of sensation into a coherence. But we also have imagination for Kant, and he calls this the schematism of imagination. So he says that we have the brute data of the material of sensation coming in, the degree of reality of an intensity, a temperature or a weight or a color, brightness, these kinds of things. He calls that intensity, degree of reality. And then we have intuition, taking it in a certain spatio-temporal whole, unifying it. But we also have the imagination basically cutting it up and taking it in a way that is coherent to us. And we can imagine this or we can grasp this work of imagination in the following way. So over here we have this diagram, the schematism. So each one of these is 6 dots, right? When you look at this one, you see them in a line. You kind of see 6 individual things, but you also see one line, one continuous line. Now, there's absolutely nothing continuous about that. The spacing of it suggests a kind of continuity, that you could connect them and it would make a line, but there's no line there. Your mind is grasping that line. It's not given immediately, but it's a pattern which you're identifying and which you're picking out. And it's that activity of the mind to pick out that pattern, which is called the schematism. So here we have kind of 2 objects, right? We have this one and that one. Again, each one of those is made up of 3, and they're not even really 3 because there's spaces between them, but just because of the pattern of it, your mind grasps it that way. And here we kind of have like a wavy thing, but there's no waviness, there's just dots. The continuity that you see that goes like this, that's your mind. And here we have like 4 kind of angling down and 3 going up. I mean, you could break those up into 2 and 4, or 3 and 3, or 3 and 4, right? The way in which you schematize that, the way in which you organize that, ordering it, that's the work of the imagination. There's nothing given in experience that says that it should be one way or the other. And that's exactly Kant's point. You're even grasping this dot as a unity. You're applying a concept to it. You're grasping it as a single manifold, a unity of a manifold, somewhat arbitrarily. I mean, sure, there is a color difference between the background and that dot, but there's actually an infinite multiplicity of points within this. You could section off any part of that and make a new unity, or you could take half of it. Why not see this as one object, or even like this half of that and half of that one as one object together? I mean, that doesn't make much sense. You could grasp like the space connecting these 2 things here as an object. It's possible. Your imagination isn't spontaneously doing that because that's not really useful to you. You know, you could look at a table and think like the corner of the table is an object completely different from the rest of the table. But your imagination naturally grasps the table as a whole. because that's useful to us. So the imagination is doing this kind of synthetic work of pulling together the multiplicity in a certain way. And this idea comes from Leibniz. He has this idea of the apperception, which is a unity of a multiplicity. It's the synthesis of a manifold. And he applied the ideas of infinitesimal calculus to understand this, that you have an infinite variety of sensuous data being synthesized into a single coherent perspective, in a very similar way as a curve involves an infinite number of different tangents going at completely different angles. And yet the curve is one continuous thread of bending across the curve. So this idea is very similar between Leibniz and Kant. Kant is borrowing it in a way. So we have an infinite variety of these degrees of reality, temperatures and weights and intensity of light and things like that. The imagination is finding a pattern, and finding a pattern that is not given in the thing, just as there's no pattern given in this object itself, but one which is useful to identify. The mind grasps it because it's in agreement with what the mind expects to find in the world. So there's nothing given in sensation that is intelligible on its own. It's by the schematism of the imagination, by the unifying of the manifold of space and time and the forms of intuition, and by applying concepts to those things, that experience becomes comprehensible. So again, one last time, this can be grasped by a concept of a totality of three things. Each one of them is a unity. Together they form a totality. Those are concepts. Those are things that we can apply equally here as we can apply to apples, as we can apply to books and trees. There are 3 trees over there. We unify things by the act of the mind. It's not given in the things themselves, and the sheer fact that it's general proves that. 3 trees, 3 apples, 3 dots. Nothing essential to those objects exhibits the threeness. The threeness is something that we do. It's a detour. It's a indirect way of understanding the thing. It's not given in the thing itself. So Kant goes from this from the transcendental aesthetic, understanding the way the mind synthesizes experience, to questioning the way that certain concepts can be applied to objects. Okay, if we have objects in experience cognized through certain concepts, what are those concepts? How many are there? Are there an infinite number? Are there a finite number? And what are they? So he tries to figure that question out. He says, working up towards this, let's read through here. He says, sense represents the appearances empirically in perception, an imagination in association and reproduction, an apperception in empirical consciousness of the identity of the reproductive representation with the appearances through which they were given, hence in recognition. So that incredibly wordy, confusing sentence is exactly what I was just describing in terms of those dots. You see the dots, there's a certain sensuous given, a brightness of the color of it, and then you have the spatio-temporal grasp of it, of simultaneity, this here, that there, an ordering of it in terms of space. Then you have the imagination associating them, grasping them in a certain pattern. Then you have concepts coming along, being applied to it, unity, totality, these kinds of things. And that's what makes recognition possible, cognition, the coherence of a certain experience. So the unity of apperception, is the synthesis of the manifold in terms of thought. And those thoughts are reducible to 12 categories. Those categories are unity, plurality, totality, reality, negation, limitation, inherence and subsistence, causality, community, possibility, existence, and necessity. Now, this is extremely abstract, and this literally is the most abstract you can get, Kant thinks. If I have a coherence of experience, if things are thinkable in terms of concepts, these concepts have to be general enough to apply everywhere. So if I can see unity in a number of different experiences, or totality in a number of different experiences, those have to be general enough, they have to be abstract enough to be able to apply in all different experiences. So these are the basic forms of thought. Thought uses these in order to understand things coherently. This is what he calls the pure concepts of the understanding. And as we can see here, causality, this is something that Hume had gone for and said, causality cannot be found in any sensations. It has to be something grounded in another way. And he said that it came through habit, and that it was a completely irrational form of thinking. Kant goes against that and says, no, it is one of the very structures of our thought itself, and that it is something that we force reality to cohere to in order to make it objective, in order to make an object, in order to make it coherent. So I'm not going to go into these in depth, and I'm not going to test you on these in depth, but these are the categories. These are the way in which we organize our experience. Cause and effect, substance and accident. That means here's a tree and it has brownness as one of its accidents, as one of its aspects. And the accident subsists within the substance. So it adheres within the substance. So you have a red apple. You connect the idea of red and apple in simultaneity. The red is in the apple. It adheres within the apple. Then you have an apple fall and hit the ground, and it imparts a certain force. Then you have causality. So all of these relationships that we perceive in the world, that we experience, these are the forms of thought itself. They are not coming from experience. They're coming from the mind and being applied to experience. So lastly, we have the original synthetic unity of apperception. So remember, we had the three major syntheses, the aesthetic, the kind of deduction side, the concepts, and now we have the apperception. So this is Kant's rebuttal to both Hume and Descartes. Personal identity, selfhood, the cogito. What is its nature? What is its reality? And what can we really say about it? So Kant goes strongly against both of them. He rejects the idea that it's habit, according to Hume, and that it's this arbitrary kind of conventional thing. But he also rejects Descartes. So he thinks that there is an I think, a cogito, but he doesn't think that we can deduce from this anything related to concepts. So this is where the idea of critique comes in. We use these concepts, unity, substance, causality, to understand the world around us and to do science. And Kant thinks that we can do that, and that we can legitimately do that. So when we critique the faculties, we say what their legitimate and illegitimate applications are. It's illegitimate to apply these concepts to the thing in itself. We can only apply them to appearances or phenomenon. So we apply them to the phenomenon of the world. We need a sensible intuition in which we apply them to. But when there's no sensible intuition, we cannot apply them. And where is there no sensible intuition? In the synthetic activity itself, in the transcendental part. So the mind is doing a certain activity of synthesis, and that brings about an object, the forms of space and time, the concepts being applied to them, the imagination doing the schematism. So the imagination, right, orders experience into a coherent pattern, and we see the pattern, but we don't see the activity. And so that's the thing that Kant wants to say. We cannot ever apply concepts to that activity itself. That's the idea we're going to work towards. So let's go through here and see what he says. He says, I think must be able to accompany all of my representations. The I think here means the cogito. So I experience something. I can always say that I think I experience something. What does that mean? It's me that thinks this experience. So I can always apply the I think to any of my representations, any of my experiences, any of the phenomenon. He says, for otherwise, something would be represented in me that could not be thought at all. So there's nothing that I experience, no representation, no perception, none of that is not something that I can't think. All of my presentations, all of my representations are thinkable. That's why I experience them. So he says, which is as much as to say that the representations would either be impossible or at least would be nothing for me. That representation that can be given prior to all thinking is called intuition. Thus, all manifold of intuition has the necessary relation to the I think in the same subject in which the manifold is to be encountered. So, if something appears to me and is able to be experienced, it's something that I can think, and it's something that I can connect the word I think to. He says, but this representation is an act of spontaneity, i.e., that is, it cannot be regarded as belonging to sensibility. I call it the pure apperception in order to distinguish it from the empirical one, or also the original apperception, since I call that self-consciousness, which, because it produces the representation I think, which must be able to accompany all others. So there's this spontaneous activity of the mind synthesizing experience. That is not something that can belong to sensibility. It's something that makes sensibility possible. It synthesizes it. This is closely related to the distinction in Descartes between formal and objective reality. The formal reality, the very unity of thought itself, is not an objective reality. It's not something given in experience. It's not something that the mind thinks. It's not a content of the mind. It's the entertainment of it. It's the unifying of it. So all of experience is being organized by thought, by a synthetic activity, but the activity itself is not something given in experience. It's not something we can look at. So we know that we're synthesizing. We look at the dots and we see a pattern. But can we look at the activity of drawing out that pattern? No. But we know that it exists. So, therefore, it is only because I can combine a manifold of given representations in one consciousness that it is possible for me to represent the identity of the consciousness in these representations itself. So, I synthesize and unify the manifold, the diversity of experience, all of these different sensations and spatial relationships and patterns and all of that. That is the condition of the possibility. And that's what Transcendental philosophy is getting at, the conditions for the possibility. The mind is a synthesizer. It's something that is bringing things together. Now, we can analyze that synthetic unity into all of these different parts. But none of that will ever be, handing us the activity itself. The activity is something continuously going on. It's a fluid operation of the mind. It's not something we can grasp as an object. This gets to this fundamental idea in Kant between noumena and phenomena. The noumena is the thing in itself. It's the real activity of the mind. The mind can be grasped in terms of a phenomenon, in terms of a appearance, But that's not the thing in itself. The thing in itself is the synthetic activity. The synthesized product is the phenomenon. The mind makes possible this coherence of experience, and we experience all of these coherent presentations and appearances, but we never have an appearance of that activity itself. So it's on the basis of this synthesis that they are bound together and synthesized into a whole. But we never grasp that activity itself. So he says, combination does not lie in the objects and cannot, as it were, be borrowed from them through perception, and by that means first taken into the understanding, but is rather only an operation of the understanding, which is itself nothing further than the faculty of combining a priori, and bringing the manifold of given representations under the unity of apperception, which is the principle, which principle is the supreme one in the whole of human cognition. So there's this supreme principle in all of human cognition, the synthetic activity of combining in general, combination. So we have experience that is combined and unified. We can never look at that activity of combination. It combines anything: senses, ideas, memories, feelings. The greatest diversity you can possibly imagine is combined by the activity of this synthetic unity. But it has no character of its own. Its only character is to combine. So this is the supreme principle of all human cognition. This is the original synthetic unity of apperception. So what is the soul? It's not a substance. It's not a causality. It's not a form of unity or totality or any of these things. It's the activity which does that. It's the activity which achieves that. So we can't say that the soul is a substance. We can't say that the soul is this or that. We can't use concepts to understand it. It is the application of concepts. It's not a concept. It's the use of concepts. It's the operation applying concepts. For though the eye is a simple representation, nothing manifold through the eye as a simple representation, nothing manifold is given. It can only be given in intuition, which is distinct from it, and thought through combination in consciousness. So it's not anything that can be given as a manifold. It's purely an activity of combining. So what does this mean? It means that we have a merely indirect knowledge of ourselves. If we understand ourselves through concepts, we have an indirect grasp of ourselves. We understand ourselves as a unity, as a causality, of a community. All of those things are concepts which the activity of our mind uses. So here we have the critique of the faculties. We critique them by saying what their application is. Where can they be applied reasonably? Where can they be legitimately used? Kant says that false problems arise from applying concepts to reality beyond experience, to things that are not given immediately in sensation. So we don't have a sensation of the whole universe. We have a sensation only of the parts of the universe that are immediately presented to us. So when we try and say what the origin of the universe is, or whether it exists in a finite time or an infinite time, or these kinds of metaphysical questions, we apply concepts in a way that it goes beyond their scope. And when we try to understand God, we say God is an infinite substance or things like that. We're misusing concepts. Concepts are only to be applied in empirical intuition. That's the idea. So when we try and understand the soul, again, we say that it's a substance or a unity or these kinds of things. No, what we're doing in that case is misusing our concepts. And we're going to come to what he calls antinomies or paradoxes. The soul is going to be both free and necessary, subject to necessity. And we're never going to be able to get outside of these antinomies, these paradoxes, these contradictory views on the thing. And they all arise because we apply concepts to things that can't be understood through concepts. So the critique of pure reason, the critique of the use of reason, is that its scope is to separate conceptual knowledge from rational knowledge, or purely rational knowledge. And this is going to become more clear in our next lesson. So we're only capable of using reason and metaphysical knowledge, knowledge of the soul's nature itself, when we apply it to moral reasoning. The rational soul is only capable of knowing itself through its exercise of its will. It can't be known through applying concepts to it, to trying to give a scientific explanation of what the soul is. Rather, it must give itself this thing called the categorical imperative, as we'll see. The will must will its own freedom, and it does that through being rational. I'm jumping ahead here, but that's where we're going to get to. So the mind is a kind of activity, it's a kind of will, it's a kind of synthesis. It acts and makes something. And what we know is the results. We know the phenomenon that it produces, the coherence of experience. But the soul itself is not one of those representations. It's not one of those coherent things that is created. The soul is not a substance, it's an activity that produces substance as a concept. So through the Copernican revolution of thought, the activity of the mind is put at the center. It's the movement of the mind which organizes everything. The synthetic activity of the mind is what is at the center, and everything else conforms to it, rather than the opposite. The mind conforms to the object. And transcendental philosophy explains the conditions of experience, the origins of experience. How does it come about? What processes of the mind are necessary in order for there to be coherent experience? And those are, again, intuition, which is the form of space and time, imagination, which grasps a certain pattern, and the application of concepts to imagination. It says that it's a totality, a unity. There's a relationship of inherence of a property within a substance, or of causality between substances.